By August 1944, German commanders believed they had reached the point where mathematics itself would stop the Americans. The Allied breakout from Normandy had shocked Europe. But speed alone did not frighten German planners. Speed had fooled armies before. What mattered was sustainability, and to German officers raised on decades of hard logistical experience, the American advance looked unsustainable, even suicidal. From reinforced headquarters in East Prussia and Western Germany, officers leaned over maps scarred with pencil marks, grease lines, and red arrows. Each arrow stretched farther east than the last. Each mile represented fuel burned, engines strained, tires shredded, men exhausted, and behind every arrow, supply lines grew thinner. The Americans, in German eyes, were repeating history's most common military mistake, advancing faster than supply could follow. German doctrine was built around this reality. No army, no matter how wealthy or confident, could escape the tyranny of logistics. Engines needed fuel, guns needed ammunition, soldiers needed food, and trucks, especially trucks, needed roads, spare parts, and time. Without those, momentum died. German officers had learned this lesson painfully in Russia. In 1941, German tanks had raced forward with terrifying success, only to stall weeks later, stranded by broken supply lines. The enemy had not defeated them. Distance had. Might had. Anti-fuel tanks had. Now, as German intelligence tracked American movement across France, the same pattern seemed to be unfolding. American armored divisions were advancing at speeds German planners considered irrational. Some units moved more than 50 miles in a single day. Others bypassed resistance entirely, trusting speed to protect them. Fuel consumption rates climbed beyond anything German staff tables considered realistic, from Normandy's beaches. The Americans were now hundreds of miles inland. The ports were limited. The railroads lay in ruins. Roads were cratered, bridges destroyed, and retreating German forces had turned infrastructure into wreckage wherever possible. To German logisticians, the conclusion was obvious. Very soon the Americans would stop. German intelligence compiled consumption estimates with clinical precision. Armored divisions required thousands of tons of fuel and ammunition every day. Infantry divisions consumed enormous quantities of food, medical supplies, and artillery shells. Trucks broke down constantly under combat conditions. Tires wore out, engines failed. Drivers collapsed. Even if the Americans possessed large numbers of trucks, and German intelligence believed they did not possess enough, the distance alone would defeat them. Moving supplies hundreds of miles by road was inefficient, slow, and fragile. Any disruption would ripple forward and paralyze the front. The Germans believed they were watching the Allied advance approach its natural limit. Confidence returned to German planning rooms for the first time in weeks. Officers spoke cautiously, but optimism crept into briefings. If the Americans could be delayed, forced to pause, the front might stabilize. New defensive lines could be prepared. Reserves could be repositioned. Time Germany's last remaining ally might be reclaimed. German commanders did not need to defeat the Americans outright. They only needed the Americans to stop, and all evidence suggested they would. Yet what the German staff did not see in their maps, what no amount of experience or calculation revealed, was that the Americans were no longer fighting the same kind of logistical war. German doctrine assumed scarcity. American doctrine assumed abundance. German logistics seemed to preserve equipment. American logistics assumed equipment would be destroyed and replaced. German planners built systems that worked perfectly under ideal conditions. American planners built systems that functioned despite constant failure. Most critically, German logistics focused on efficiency. American logistics focused on volume. Behind the advancing American spearheads, A different war was being fought, one invisible to German reconnaissance and misunderstood by German intelligence. While German planners counted miles and fuel consumption, American officers were abandoning traditional methods entirely. They were not trying to move supplies carefully. They were trying to move everything. The German belief that the Americans would soon halt rested on one unchallenged assumption, that supply lines had limits. The Americans were about to prove that assumption wrong. No German officer had ever planned for a road that never slept. In late August 1944, while German commandos waited for American supply lines to collapse, something entirely different began to form behind the Allied front. It was not announced with speeches or directives carved into doctrine. It did not emerge from a master plan drawn months in advance. It appeared out of desperation, improvisation, and a refusal to accept limits. American logistics officers were facing a crisis that traditional methods could no longer solve. Railroads were broken beyond immediate repair. Ports were overwhelmed. Depots were too far behind the front. Scheduled convoys moved too slowly. Every established system, designed for a methodical advance, had failed under the speed of combat. The front was moving faster than the rear could think. Inside makeshift headquarters scattered across liberated France, officers stared at numbers that made no sense. Daily consumption rates climbed higher than any previous campaign. Fuel disappeared as fast as it arrived. Artillery units fired at rates never planned for. Tank battalions burned through gasoline at a pace that turned maps into jokes. The problem was simple and terrifying. If supplies did not arrive continuously, the advance would die. American officers did not ask whether a solution was doctrinally correct. They asked whether it would work. And no one later agreed exactly who asked the most dangerous question of all. What if we stopped pretending this was a normal supply problem? The idea that emerged was radical in its simplicity and terrifying in its scale. Instead of sending supplies in carefully timed convoys, what if the road itself became the system? Instead of managing shipments, what if trucks never stopped moving? Instead of efficiency, what if the answer was relentless flow? It was an idea that violated nearly every rule of military logistics taught at staff colleges. Roads were supposed to be shared. Convoys were supposed to disperse. Vehicles were supposed to rest. Drivers were supposed to sleep. Headlights were supposed to be dark at night. Breakdowns were supposed to be repaired, not abandoned. This idea ignored all of that. The concept was brutally simple. Create a one-way road system dedicated entirely to supply. Loaded trucks would move forward without interruption. Empty trucks would return on separate routes. No crossings. No delays. No mixed traffic. No debate. The road would never sleep. To German doctrine, this was madness. Roads were fragile assets. They required protection, camouflage, discipline, and strict control. A road filled continuously with vehicles was an invitation to disaster. To American officers, it was the only way forward. Orders were issued with astonishing speed. French roads were seized and marked with colored signs. Military police were deployed not to manage traffic carefully, but to remove obstacles aggressively. Any vehicle that could not maintain speed was pushed aside. Any driver who hesitated was replaced. Any rule that slowed movement was discarded. The system did not wait to become perfect. It began immediately. Trucks rolled out before dawn and did not stop at night. Headlights burned openly. Exhaust fumes hung in the air like fog. Engines screamed under constant strain. The sound of movement never ceased. Drivers were given instructions that would have horrified German transport officers. Keep moving. Do not stop unless absolutely necessary. If your vehicle fails, get it off the road immediately. Another truck will take your load. Speed matters more than preservation. The road became a living thing, pulsing eastward. German reconnaissance units were among the first to witness it. Patrols reported continuous vehicle movement that defied explanation. There were no gaps, no pauses, no attempt at concealment. At night, the road glowed like a river of fire. German officers dismissed early reports as exaggeration. Such behavior was suicidal. Any air attack would devastate it. Any artillery strike would paralyze it. A single disabled vehicle could block everything behind it, but no such paralysis occurred. What German observers failed to understand was that American planners had abandoned the idea of preventing fire. Allure, they assumed failure would happen constantly. Engines would break, tires would burst, drivers would collapse, accidents would occur, and the system was built to absorb all of it. Mobile repair teams followed the road like scavengers, fixing what could be fixed and discarding what could not. Spare parts were stripped from dead vehicles without ceremony. Entire trucks were sacrificed to keep the flow alive. The road did not slow for the wounded. American drivers learned quickly that the road obeyed only one law: movement. Those who could not keep up learned to pull aside without being told. Those who hesitated found military police waving them off the road. The culture of the road became unforgiving, mechanical, and brutally efficient. Yet within that harshness, something unexpected formed. Drivers began to see themselves not as individuals, but as part of a machine larger than any unit. Each truck was replaceable. Each load mattered. The mission was not survival, it was continuity. Many of these drivers had never been trusted with such responsibility before. A significant number were African American soldiers assigned to transport units in a segregated army. They were expected to drive, not to be seen, not to be celebrated. Now, they were the system. They drove through darkness without blackout discipline, knowing full well what German doctrine predicted would happen. They drove through rain, dust, and exhaustion. They drove with engines overheating and brakes screaming. Some drove until they could no longer remember where they were. And still the road flowed. German intelligence began collecting reports that did not fit any known model. Traffic density exceeded theoretical limits. Repair rates exceeded expectations. Fuel availability appeared endless. Losses occurred, but replacement was immediate. German officers attempted to calculate how long such madness could last. Their calculations were wrong. The Americans were not trying to sustain the road indefinitely. They were trying to overwhelm time itself. Every day the road functioned was a day gained. Every hour of movement compressed German reaction time. The road did not exist to be safe. It existed to be unstoppable. As supplies poured forward, American combat units noticed something unprecedented. They no longer waited. Ammunition arrived before it was requested. Fuel trucks appeared as engines ran dry. Artillery units fired without restraint. The front no longer paused to catch its breath. German defensive planning unraveled. Positions prepared based on assumed American pauses were bypassed before they were occupied. Units ordered to counterattack found the Americans already beyond reach. The rhythm of war shifted from measured to relentless. The road was not merely supplying the advance. It was dictating it. German commanders had believed that the Americans would eventually reach a natural stopping point, a place where supply failed and caution returned. Instead, they faced an enemy whose logistics removed the very concept of culmination, The road that should not exist had erased distance as a weapon. And the Germans were only beginning to understand what that meant. German military science had always treated logistics as a limiting factor. American logistics treated it as a force multiplier. By early September 1944, German intelligence officers were no longer asking whether the American supply system would collapse. That question had already been answered. The convoys did not slow, the roads did not empty, the front did not pause. Instead, American movement accelerated in ways that made traditional German defensive planning irrelevant. The failure of German predictions forced a painful reassessment. This was no longer a case of American recklessness temporarily succeeding. Something fundamental had changed. The Americans were not supplying an advance, they were driving it. German doctrine assumed that increased consumption weakened an army. Every extra mile meant more fuel burned, more spare parts needed, more strain on men and machines. The Americans inverted this logic. Increased consumption was not a sign of vulnerability, it was evidence of momentum. Where German logisticians sought balance, Americans embraced excess. Supplies arrived in quantities far beyond immediate need. Ammunition stacked higher than regulations allowed. Fuel was stored in forward dumps that seemed irrationally close to the front. Entire truckloads were delivered just in case, a concept German planners found irresponsible. Yet this excess created something German armies never possessed: freedom. American commanders no longer had to ask whether an action was logistically possible. They assumed it was. Orders were issued based on opportunity, not limitation. If a gap appeared, it was exploited immediately. If resistance collapsed, the advance continued without pause. Speed became a form of protection. German counterattacks failed not because they lacked courage or firepower, but because they struck ghosts by the time units assembled. American forces were already beyond their planned points of engagement. Maps became obsolete. Faster than they could be updated, German officers began referring to American operations not as advances, but as floods. A flood does not maneuver, it overwhelms. The sheer volume of American supply changed the psychology of war. German soldiers noticed it first. They heard engines at all hours. They saw endless columns of trucks. They watched artillery fire without ration, where German units counted rounds. American units counted minutes. The imbalance was devastating. American artillery became particularly terrifying. Guns fired continuously. Unconcerned with conservation, barrages lasted hours, then resumed after brief pauses. German officers knew such firepower should be impossible at such distances from supply bases, but it was happening. The reason was simple. American logistics no longer relied on careful preservation, it relied on replacement. Trucks were expected to fail, tires were expected to wear out, engines were expected to die. None of this mattered as long as movement continued. German planners still believed that inefficiency would eventually destroy the system. Loss rates were unsustainable by European standards. Vehicles were abandoned that German mechanics would have repaired. Drivers were pushed beyond limits German doctrine considered dangerous. And yet, American capacity absorbed these losses without visible strain. Every destroyed truck was replaced. Every exhausted driver was relieved. Every failed engine was swapped. The system did not collapse under waste, it thrived on redundancy. Volume covered mistakes. German commanders struggled to understand this mindset. Their armies had been built around scarcity. Fuel was precious. Vehicles were irreplaceable. Men were conserved carefully. Every loss weakened the whole. American forces operated under a different assumption. Industry would replace what war consumed. This difference changed everything. German intelligence reports began using language that betrayed unease. Words like excessive, irrational, and wasteful appeared repeatedly. But beneath the criticism lay fear. The Americans were doing what German theory said should not. Work and winning because of it. Attempts to disrupt the supply flow failed. Small attacks inflicted local damage but changed nothing. Destroyed trucks were pushed aside. Damaged roads were bypassed. New routes appeared overnight. There was no single point of failure. German officers realized too late that the American system had removed the vulnerability they had been trained to exploit. Traditional interdiction relied on scarcity. The Americans drowned scarcity in abundance. More disturbing was the decentralization of decision-making. Junior American officers made logistics decisions independently. Sergeants redirected convoys. Drivers chose alternate routes without waiting for orders. The system adapted faster than German. Headquarters could respond. German command culture, built on hierarchy and control, could not match this speed. The Americans had turned logistics into a weapon not by refining it, but by unleashing it. The battlefield was no longer shaped by where supplies could reach. Supplies reached everywhere. German forces were not fighting American units anymore. They were fighting an industrial process that moved faster than human reaction. By mid-September, German commanders began to understand the true danger. This was not simply a campaign problem. It was a strategic one. If an army could advance without a logistical culminating point, then defense based on exhaustion was meaningless. Delayed tactics failed. Attrition favored the side that could replace faster. The Americans were not just advancing through France. They were redefining how modern war functioned. And Germany did not have an answer. The German generals saw numbers. They did not see the men. Maps, tonnage tables, fuel estimates, and traffic density reports filled German intelligence files. But none of those documents captured the reality inside the cabs of the trucks that kept the American advance alive. The system that terrified German planners was not powered by theory or machinery alone. It was powered by exhausted human beings, for the men driving the supply routes. The war did not look like a campaign of sweeping arrows and collapsing fronts. It looked like headlights cutting through darkness, hands locked onto steering wheels, engines screaming beneath the floorboards, and the constant pressure to keep moving no matter what. Many of these drivers had been assigned to transport units because the army did not consider them suitable for combat. A large number were African-American soldiers serving in a segregated military that denied them equal status, promotion, and recognition. They wore the uniform, but not the respect that came with it. Yet now, the entire American advance depended on them. Their days blended together. Time lost meaning. Sleep came in fragments measured in minutes, not hours. Drivers learned to eat while rolling, to rest their eyes at fuel stops, to wake themselves by slapping their faces or biting their lips when exhaustion threatened to pull them off the road. The road showed no mercy. Accidents were frequent. Overloaded trucks skidded on damaged pavement. Brakes overheated and failed. Engines caught fire. Fog and rain turned night driving into blind entrance tests. When a truck crashed, there was no ceremony. The wreck was pushed aside. The road flowed round it. Drivers understood this without being told. If you stopped, you became the problem, despite the danger. Morale remained high in ways German observers could not comprehend. These men understood the significance of what they were doing. They were not merely delivering supplies. They were proving something to the enemy, to their own army, and to themselves. They knew the ideology they were fighting. They knew what Nazi racial doctrine claimed about. People who looked like them, and every mile driven, every delivery completed, was a direct contradiction of that belief. Inside the cab, hierarchy faded. The mission was everything. Skill mattered more than rank, endurance mattered more than regulation. Drivers learned to fix their own vehicles, improvise repairs, and make decisions independently. Waiting for orders was a luxury the road did not allow. German prisoners who later encountered these drivers were stunned. The men they had been taught to consider inferior were operating the most complex logistics system they had ever witnessed. They navigated routes, calculated loads, and maintained vehicles with calm professionalism under conditions that broke experienced European transport units. The physical cost was severe. Many drivers operated for days with minimal rest, relying on stimulants to stay awake. Hallucinations were common. Men reported seeing obstacles that were not there, hearing voices in engine noise, or losing track of distance entirely. Some collapsed at the wheel and were pulled out only to climb into another truck hours later. Deaths occurred quietly. Crashes, fires, exhaustion. There were no medals waiting at the roadside. The road did not slow for funerals, and yet the drivers kept going. They developed their own culture. Slogans appeared on truck doors. Nicknames were painted across hoods. Humor became armor. Jokes masked fatigue. Rivalries formed between units based on speed and reliability. Pride grew from being essential. For many, this was the first time their contribution truly mattered. German intelligence failed to grasp this human element. They assumed such pressure would break morale. It did not. The drivers were not motivated by fear of punishment or rigid discipline. They were driven by ownership of the mission. This distinction mattered. German transport units had historically relied on strict control. Orders flowed downward. Deviations were punished. Initiative was dangerous. American logistics thrived on the opposite principle. Drivers were trusted to solve problems as they encountered them. This flexibility saved the system repeatedly. When roads became impassable, drivers found alternatives. When bridges were destroyed, bypasses appeared overnight. When supply points moved, the road adjusted. The system survived not because it was perfectly designed, but because the men inside it adapted constantly. German commanders, watching from a distance, could not replicate this. Their doctrine did not allow it. Their structure punished it. By the time German intelligence recognized the human dimension of the American logistics machine, it was too late. You could destroy vehicles. You could crater roads. You could harass convoys. But you could not break a system that relied on human initiative multiplied by industrial abundance. The Americans had created something Germany could not counter. A logistics force powered by people who believed in what they were doing and were given the freedom to make it work. The road was not just steel and fuel. It was willpower, moving forward at 35 miles per hour. By September 1944, the realization began to spread through German command circles with a quiet, terrifying clarity. The American advance had not slowed. It had not collapsed under the weight of its own ambition. It had not paused to reorganize, retreat, or wait for conditions to improve. It had adapted. What German planners had dismissed as recklessness was revealing itself as something far more dangerous, a system designed to function under strain. The Americans were not ignoring logistics. They were redefining it in real time. Reports arriving at German headquarters became increasingly difficult to reconcile with established doctrine. Units that should have been immobilized by fuel shortages were still maneuvering. Artillery that should have fallen silent continued firing. Armored divisions that should have halted for resupply were instead pressing forward with renewed aggression. Every German calculation said this should be impossible, and yet it was happening. The breaking point came not with a single battle, but with a pattern, again and again. German commanders prepared counterattacks based on the assumption that American units had overextended themselves. Again and again, Those counterattacks ran into fully supplied, fully coordinated resistance. The Americans were not outrunning their logistics. Their logistics were outrunning German expectations. For decades, German military culture had emphasized operational brilliance. Rapid maneuvers, decisive battles, and bold commanders had defined its victories. But these strengths relied on one assumption, that the enemy would eventually reach a limit. The Americans never did. By late summer, German fuel reserves were critically low. Ammunition stocks were dwindling. Replacement vehicles were scarce. Rail lines were shattered by Allied air power. Repair depots lay in ruins. Units were cannibalizing their own equipment to stay operational. Meanwhile, American supply dumps multiplied behind the front. Temporary depots appeared almost overnight. Roads once clogged by retreating German forces now flowed with American traffic in both directions, day and night. The contrast was impossible to ignore. German soldiers at the front noticed first. Prisoners taken during engagements spoke openly of the abundance they had seen. Hot meals, spare parts, medical supplies, fresh units rotating into combat with equipment intact. These were not rumors, they were realities. Morale inside German units began to erode in subtle but irreversible ways. It was not fear of American soldiers that broke confidence. It was the knowledge that the enemy could afford mistakes. The Americans could absorb losses, correct errors, and continue forward without pause. Germany could not. Attempts to disrupt the American supply system intensified. Air raids targeted roads. Artillery shelled transport routes. Small units launched ambushes against convoys. Bridges were destroyed. Crossroads cratered. Forests mined. The effect was minimal. Each disruption was met with a workaround. Roads were repaired faster than they could be destroyed. Convoys rerouted within hours. Temporary bridges replaced permanent ones. Engineers moved as quickly as infantry. The system bent. But it did not break. This adaptability forced German commanders into an impossible position. Traditional defensive strategies relied on slowing an enemy long enough to reorganize or counterattack. But slowing the Americans no longer produced meaningful results. Delays did not weaken them. They simply gave them time to bring more forward. By early autumn, German intelligence reports grew blunt. Analysts began acknowledging what senior officers had avoided saying aloud. The Americans were not fighting the war Germany had prepared for. They were fighting a war of sustained pressure. No single defeat would stop them. No single victory would save Germany. The war had become a test of endurance, and Germany was losing it, inside the American command structure. This reality was understood differently. Leaders like Patton, Bradley, and Eisenhower did not speak of logistics as a limitation. They spoke of it as a weapon. Fuel was maneuver. Ammunition was momentum. Supply lines were arteries, not vulnerabilities. This philosophy reshaped decision-making. Commanders took risks not because they were reckless, but because they trusted the system behind them. When a breakthrough appeared, they exploited it immediately, confident that support would follow. And it did. German forces found themselves reacting instead of shaping the battlefield. Initiative slipped away. Decisions became defensive, cautious and delayed. Each delay widened the gap between what Germany needed to do and what it could actually accomplish. By the time American units reached the borders of Germany itself, the outcome was no longer in doubt. The question was no longer whether Germany would lose, only how long it could continue. Looking back, historians would debate battles, generals, and political decisions. But beneath every argument lay a simpler truth. Germany had prepared to fight armies. America had prepared to sustain them. The Red Ball Express, the engineers, the drivers, the planners, the factories, the ports, and the people behind them formed a force no battlefield genius could outmaneuver. The war was decided not only by courage or strategy, but by the ability to keep moving when logic said movement should stop. Germany understood this. Too late, the roads told the story before the maps did. And by the time the lesson was clear, the destination was already inevitable.